Okay, well, welcome everybody to the latest Knowledge Network on Climate Assembly Learning Call. Really delighted that we've got this opportunity to learn about the People's Plan for Nature, which was commissioned by three of the UK's largest conservation organisations. I'll come and mention a bit more about that in a minute. I just want to remind everybody that we are recording this call. So if you don't want your image to be seen, then please make sure you got your camera off. Please make sure that you put any conversations that any questions that you've got into the chat, and we'll try and make sure that the various participants are able to answer them. Just a little bit of background on the People's Plan for Nature. As I said, it was organised not by government, but by three conservation charities, by the RSPB, the Royal Society for the Protection of Birds, WWF, and the National Trust. And it ran between November 2022 to February 2023, over 4 weekends, the middle two of which were online. And the citizens were asked, what should we do to protect and restore nature in the UK? What's really interesting about this process, not only that it was run by these three conservation organisations, but it was preceded by a national conversation through which they had over 30,000 responses in terms of what kind of nature future would people like to see. And what is really interesting about this is the response to this assembly came from the commissioners and also from other stakeholders who are responsible for actions in this area. So we're going to be joined by 5 people. We've got a nice, a really interesting array of people. We've got Helen Meech, who is at the moment, who's now leads the Climate Coalition, but was previously at RSPB. We've got Kathryn Machin from the World Wildlife Fund from WWF. We've got Rebecca Lester, who was an Assembly member. We've got Sarah Castell, who is from Involve, who delivered the Assembly. She's on a train, and so we're going to be shifting things around a bit and hope that her connection holds. And we've also got Irenie, I should have checked the surname, Ekkeshis. I'm sure that was wrong, from the new Citizenship Project, who influenced the design of the process. So all 5 of those people will be moving in and out of the conversation. But I'd like to start off by inviting both Helen and Kat into the space and talk about some of the motivations behind the project. So see if have we got Kat? There we go. Fantastic. So this is a really unusual project. This is like no other project that we are aware of. Obviously, there was an assembly run by some German civil society organizations, but that was aimed at influencing a particular election. So I kind of want to start from the beginning. Why on earth are 3 conservation organizations running a citizens' assembly? And I think I need to start with you, Helen, because I think initially this was your idea.
For my sins, yes. So why did we start on this journey? I guess we didn't start with thinking about we were going to run a deliberative democracy process. Where we started was started with 2 organisations. It started with RSPB and WWF, and Kat and I were tasked with thinking about a project which we were working on together called Wild Isles. Wild Isles was a major BBC documentary series fronted by Sir David Attenborough, and Attenborough's first ever series looking at UK nature. And we knew, as all of these Attenborough series do, that it was going to attract a massive audience. We were hoping for a TV audience of 10 million. I think we got as high as 12 million for the most watched episode. So we knew that there was going to be a lot of conversation at that time about UK nature, and what we wanted to do as organisations was look at how do we take that kind of moment, that cultural moment focused on the awe and wonder of UK nature, and channel it into a conversation about action for nature, because the UK is one of the most depleted nations on earth in terms of our nature and biodiversity. So the exam question, I suppose, that Kat and I were handed was like, how do we use this cultural moment of an Attenborough TV series to mobilise 1 million people to take action for nature? And there are loads of different ways that we could have approached that. But we sort of started with the kind of principle that we wanted to co-create what that mobilisation looked like with the UK public. There's been sort of previous examples of these big set piece documentary series that have led to changes in behaviour. So probably the most famous is Blue Planet 2. There's that really famous scene where there was the mother whale with her calf that had been that died from swallowing plastic bags, and that did lead to a big change in consumer behaviour around use of plastic carrier bags. But it led to that very simplistic individual behaviour change. And if you look at the system that sits around that, actually we produce more plastic now than we ever did before Blue Planet 2. It led to an individual change in behaviour, but it did not change the system. So we started thinking about what interventions could we make as NGOs that kind of, when that TV series hit our screens, we could channel all of that energy and debate and awareness into a series of actions and into public mobilisation that would lead to systemic change. And we came to the idea of deliberative democracy as a mode for doing that. Kat, I don't know if you want to build on that.
She was just about to take a drink of her tea and then
I know.
Perfectly timed. Yeah, so adding to that, there's also the conundrum that we are facing in the UK that with this government in particular, the one that that is currently in office, NGO influence is waning. It is not as easy to influence government as it had been only 10, 15 years ago. At the same time, public trust in government is eroding at a rate of knots, and there are lots of reasons that go into both of those things. So trying to influence systemic change when your ability to speak to the powers that be is limited because you are dismissed as simply being an NGO, and so of course you'd say that's your job to say that. The RSPB are going to say that you shouldn't put buildings there because birds are nesting. That's exactly what you would expect the RSPB to say. Similar for our charity at WWF and the National Trust also. And the public, to a similar extent, hasn't seen the change in nature that they may have been expecting, considering that the three of the largest charities that convene this event have a collective age of over 150 years, and yet we're in still one of the most nature depleted countries in the world. So everything that Helen has just said about that need to put the citizens' voice front and center of this is backed up by the fact that if we don't do that, our influencing will be less impactful. And I think genuinely, and this is something that Helen and I have always shared this view, that we have a duty of care to our supporters and to the public. A lot of the people trust our organisations to fight for nature on their behalf. But unless we open our own ears to what the people want and what the public want to see, how can we possibly do that with authenticity? And that's why one of the calls to action is actually the actor groups is facing into ourselves. It's holding our own feet to the fire, which is something that we are continually doing and we're continually responding to. So that's some of the reasoning behind it. The other thing that makes the People's Plan for Nature slightly different is that it's not just government actors that we are calling on change from. The public have set out actions for government at both the local and national scale. For businesses, there is a major emphasis on food businesses within that, but it applies more broadly to for ourselves as nature NGOs and then for individuals and communities, because we recognise that the Blue Planet effect is still really important. People need to feel like they have agency over their the change that they want to see, and so taking the action to reduce your plastic use or to limit your meat intake is still just as important, and having a public mandate to do so and seeing people that look and sound like you do that too is really important in building this movement. So yeah, it is a response to all of those problems, I guess, problem statements, challenges, whatever you want to call it.
I'm kind of interested that you sort of landed on this idea of an assembly. I mean, you've called it a people's assembly, but it's what other people would call a citizens' assembly. I completely understand why you use that term. As a sort of centerpiece to this is something which typically we've seen governments run, and people like yourselves make calls on government to run those things. So why did you decide that that was the institution that would work for you? Because it seems so far away from the way that your organizations have previously done public engagement or done their campaigning work. This feels like a qualitative shift in the sort of way that you engage with the public?
It was a really, really different way of working for us. We didn't just run an assembly. What we ran was a kind of a broad public engagement process, which included citizens' assembly at the heart of it. And I'm sure Irenie and Oliver on the call will come on to talk a bit more about their theory around rapid democracy. But I came into RSPB and came into this sort of question around how do we use this moment of Wild Isles to lead to action. And I'd just been working with the government of Jersey and the new Citizenship Project on their Jersey's Big Climate Conversation. So I'd seen the power that kind of a broad conversation, and that conversation involved all islanders of Jersey in that process. I'd seen the power that process could have. And I'd seen the power of deliberative democracy to make recommendations, which then can be discussed by a wider public and a wider set of actors before driving change. So was excited to think about how the NGO community might work with that type of thinking and might work with deliberative democracy to drive change. It also felt like a powerful, Kat talked about the importance of us working not just with government, but looking at kind of the role that other actors could play, and crucially looking at the role our own organisations wanted to play. So this was, it was in part, I suppose, a listening campaign to help us understand how could our organisations be better serve our purpose and better serve our members and supporters too. So it was a project that was both designed to make the most of a particular moment in time, but also to test a different way of working and contracting with our members and supporters to drive change, which felt really, really exciting.
Okay, so this is interesting. So Helen, you've had direct experience of an assembly. You know what they do. Kat, you hadn't. So when this was proposed to you, to be honest, what was your initial reaction that we're going to run a citizens' assembly and this is going to really challenge the way we do things? Did you think everyone would have gone mad, or were you? What did you guys?
No, I was really excited. By chance, a few projects previous to this, I had put together a paper that had suggested that what we might need is a assembly or public dialogue around agriculture in the UK. And we were actually, that was inspired by a programme that was being ran by Danny Jordan, who is now the campaign and communities director at Surfers Against Sewage. She actually ran those public dialogues through WWF. And that had really inspired me in the power not only of getting that listening campaign and understanding what the public perspective is, but seeing the shift in the citizens and their kind of personal connection as they move through this process of being more informed around the issues. So I'd seen it in a public dialogue perspective previous, and then also I just watched the documentary on the people versus climate change. So it was basically that. And then actually in the sign-off process, and I'm sure our exec director won't mind me saying this, it had been quite tricky to get WWF to think that this was a good idea. And then our executive director watched that same documentary, cried her eyes out, and it was signed off within weeks of that happening. So we started just playing the trailer for that process to every decision maker we could, because the proof of concept is there and it's existent in other citizens' assemblies. And a lot of our theory of change that sits behind the People's Plan for Nature is based off the learning from the Climate Assembly UK, which is why there's such an emphasis on it having its own look and feel, is why it's such an emphasis on citizens being at the front and centre of the communications around the plan. And the reason that we went with something as big as this off the back of the Wild Isles series, because we wanted people to feel the plan, not just understand it from an academic perspective. It needs to feel from the public. It's got to be more emotive than usual for a science campaign.
So this is really, for those who are on the call who haven't heard of this. This is a particular documentary that was created about the Citizens Assembly UK, which we've talked about previously on previous KNOCA calls, and you can find out more on the website. But it's a really nice documentary that follows 4 or 5 of the participants and gets a real sense of their sort of very different journeys, and they're really very, very powerful. So it's really interesting that that's a really useful internal advocacy tool. That's a really useful thing to know. So I'm going to ask you a very blunt question, and I don't mean it be to be rude, but some people might say your civil society organisations, you're running an assembly. How can we trust that? I mean, you could say that about governments as well, but let's just stick with this. This is mostly something we think of governments running. Suddenly, you're campaigning organisations, and you're running a citizens' assembly. Surely that's deeply problematic. I know that you've had some criticism, not much, but you've had a bit of criticism. Probably were expecting more than that, but how do you answer that question of this is not the right way to use deliberative instruments? Which, by the way, I don't believe. But I want to offer you that. that thought is out there. How can campaigning organisations do deliberative democracy like this?
That's something we interrogated for about 9 months before we signed the project off. And I think, in fact, one of the big learnings from the project is that we should have given it a bit more time. We ran a bit fast on some parts of the project, but that was in part because we really thought deeply about, is this the right thing for us to do, and how do we put mitigations around it to ensure that it is a credible, independent process. So the decision was made when we did sign it off and we sought a third strategic partner. And National Trust came on board. They are another NGO, but they do have huge landholdings, credibility as a business, as a farmer, which we felt which helped give that balance. They're not solely a campaigning organisation. And we put in place a series of mechanisms to ensure that this was a credible, independent process. So that included working with external partners to deliver it. So this process was powered by our 3 organisations. We helped conceive the idea. We helped fundraise for it, but then it was delivered by a series of external partners, including Evolve, who are on the call today, who ran the deliberative process for us. We then ensured that the whole process from start to finish was overseen by an independent advisory group, and that was made up by a range of individuals from a range of different perspectives, from farming unions to water companies to academics, a real vast range of people on that independent advisory group who oversaw the process from start to finish. And that felt really important. And also we sort of set some sort of broad parameters for things that we wanted to cover, but then sort of step back, and that process of selecting witnesses and advocates that went before the Assembly, that was all overseen by Evolve with the help of that independent advisory group. We used our networks and our contacts, of course, to reach out to people, but kind of that process did have that independent oversight.
So you think that it is possible to kind of put a firewall in between the commission? I mean, in the same way that national governments sometimes do, they can put a firewall in between. You must have had colleagues who wanted to fiddle with it. You must have had kind of people. You must have had to defend that firewall at various points.
I've never heard the term sausage factory so frequently in my life. So there was a real concern that if you get out what you put in, and that's where the advisory group comes in really strongly, because we don't have a say in what goes forward and what is put in front of the Assembly. So that was really important. I also think independence of the Assembly is very, very important, but you can overplay it to the point where it is no longer workable. And if a citizens' assembly happens but nobody hears it and nobody knows it's happened, has it made an impact? And our organisations have the ability to platform this and to platform the outputs, which could only come if we had convened it. There's no way you could get the 3 organisations standing behind something that they didn't commission in the first place. So actually us bringing our communication weight behind it, launching it a week after a nature documentary fronted by Sir David Attenborough, was the best opportunity for the public voice to be heard. And we saw it with government. The Climate Assembly UK happened, and one of the best pieces of communications around it was the documentary. But if you haven't watched the documentary, did you know there was a Citizens' Assembly on climate change in the UK? You probably don't. And we're still struggling to get cut through, even with all the comms weight behind our 3 organisations on this, because it is big and it's hard, and trying to cut through anything at the moment is difficult. But that for me is, you don't throw the baby out with the bathwater for the sake of pure independence. So yeah.
Independence is actually probably, I'm thinking aloud here, independence is probably the wrong word. It's actually integrity, isn't it?
Integrity, yeah, exactly. And we had such faith in the fact that the way that this was created had integrity baked in because of Involve and the reputation that they hold, because of New Citizenship Project and the experience that they had in building it, and the fact that our organisations do have public trust. Generally speaking, we are trusted organisations. We are trusted with the science and the mainstream around those pieces, and we face criticism all the time, and I think we can hold ourselves high with the fact that we do operate with integrity. So I wasn't as worried about that. I'm actually a bit annoyed that we didn't get more scrutiny, because I'm always ready for a fight on it, and I haven't had one.
I know you're much more involved in comms, and no, any news is good news, isn't it? It's
yeah, exactly. When it does prickle up the feathers of people that, you know, are scared to lose power, then that opens up the conversation again. So that I was always hoping for maybe a little bit more controversy, but actually it's great that it didn't have that.
People didn't question it. That's good. On that note, I'm going to just bring in Sarah into the conversation, if this works. She's on a train. Sarah is the director of Involve. Let's see if her connection is working.
Hello there, Graham. Hi. I'm going to leave my camera off if that's all right, just to protect the connection. And I apologise to everyone if I suddenly get loud train noises. Can you hear me? Okay.
Yeah, we can hear you. And I'm just wondering about, you don't want to show your face because you're embarrassed about the project. I don't think that's the case, is it? I think you're so. Sarah, do you have any second thoughts about working with campaigning organisations, given that almost all of your work previously has been, not all of it, but a lot of it has been through government commission work, particularly around assemblies? Was there a worry within Involve? Did you have to think quite carefully about this?
We absolutely thought carefully about it, but not because we were worried, but because we wanted to see how this piece of the jigsaw could fit into our larger project of bringing deliberative democracy and bringing deliberative and participative processes to all sorts of decision making. So it's fair to say that we have done some of the great climate assemblies, other assemblies commissioned by central and local government, but that's absolutely not the only work we've done. You know, we work for energy providers. We're working on a water assembly at the moment. We like to use these methods, these deliberative instruments, to change in lots of different places. And this project.
Oh, Sarah, is it
breaking up?
The connection's breaking up. I'm really sorry. I think we're going to have.
Oh dear, I'm so sorry.
I'll just try one other question for you. What was the highlight for you of this process? And we'll see if we can get that from you. So, you know, this is a new way of using deliberative processes. What was the highlight from your perspective?
I think the very end, where we formulated the recommendations and brought them back to the people in the very last session and heard them say that, yes, that was what they wanted. And the working together with the 3 charities and the people in the room was a really special and exciting moment, as was seeing all of the learning from the national conversation feeding in an exhibition at the beginning. I hope you heard that. I'm going to write something in the chat about the answer to your earlier question, so hopefully people can read it. I'm so sorry about the reception.
Sarah, and I completely apologise. I apologise to people, but completely understand why Sarah needed to be on a train today. So anyway, we got the impression that she wasn't embarrassed, Helen and Kat, of working with you. That's good. That's good. That's really good. What she did mention, I wanted to push her a bit more on, is you started this off with a national conversation. And I'm going to talk a little bit to Irene about this, how she sees this as a model. But why was it important for you to have that national conversation first, and how did that actually feed into the assembly? Because it's always difficult to think about how do you do big public engagement around a deliberative process.
Yeah, so we didn't. We always set out that this was the People's Assembly for Nature was part of a broader process, and we worked with the New Citizenship Project and their rapid democracy model to design the programme as a whole. So we started with the principle of a national conversation because the nature crisis affects everyone, and therefore we wanted everybody to have their say. We obviously couldn't bring the whole nation into a room, or 4 nations into a room. We could only ever bring together about 100 people, but we wanted to kind of give the space to hear from everybody. So we went out with 3 key questions. We asked people, what do you love about UK nature? What would you miss if it disappeared? We asked them to think about 2050 and what would be different from now in a nature-rich UK. And we also essentially crowdsourced the best of what's happening out there already. So we asked people to share case studies and stories of people taking brilliant action for nature. And the purpose of doing that was both, it gave everybody a voice, and it also gave us a real richness of insight and a sense of kind of the public mood and the public connection to nature and why that matters, which could then inform the deliberative process. So as well as hearing from kind of experts on nature conservation, from supermarkets, from farmers, from a range of different actors, they also heard throughout all of the 4 assembly sessions input from this national conversation, which felt really important and actually was really well received by the participants as well, I think.
And what was the best way, do you think, that you were of actually managing? So, you get a large, diffuse amount of information. How were you able to present that in a way that was meaningful for the assembly itself?
And we did it in lots of different ways. There was kind of some data analysis of the whole that pulled out key themes that were coming through. So, for example, there were key themes that came through about like why nature matters to people, why people love nature, which touched upon kind of their mental health, their sense of identity, and so on. There was also kind of some key themes that came through around like what needs to change. So things like, the way that we think about green space, the way that our economy affects nature, and so on. There were kind of a series of key themes that came through about the changes that need to happen. But we also then, so we kind of did that kind of analysis of the data set as a whole, but then we also kind of used lots of creative methods to bring it into the conversation as well. So we took kind of a series of quotes from that national conversation, and the New Citizenship Project worked with a brilliant illustrator to then bring those quotes to life for people visually. And we had an exhibition that was part of the opening of the whole assembly process, and people could go around and reflect on those different quotes and see if they could see themselves in it, and what did they identify with them, and what didn't they, and why is that. And that was a really, really great way to introduce the assembly weekend. And then we kind of continue to feed that insight throughout the process.
Okay, that's really interesting, because I think a lot of people have really found it difficult to think how to connect a wider public to the deliberations. And I want to come back to the question about how you connect that to the actual deliberations to the wider public afterwards in a second. But I'm kind of interested that both of your organisations and National Trust and a couple of other organisations, 2 or 3 organisations who weren't part of the process, actually offered responses. So in the same way that we would expect a government response to a government organised assembly, your organisations made a response. Other organisations who had been named or were stakeholders had made a response. There's a whole series of, we'll put the link up, of organisations that have done that. I'm trying to get a sense of, you've got the formal response, but for both of you, and obviously I know, Helen, you've left RSPB now, so you can probably be a bit, I don't know whether that means you're more open or you don't want to say anything, but what value do you think it has been for your organisations to have this assembly, to have to respond to it? What's that meant for your organisations? Kat, do you want to start maybe?
I can definitely start. I mean, for me, it's actually most valuable as an internal influencing piece. We have a chronic issue of short-term memory when it comes to campaigning in the NGO space. Campaigns should be, and the most effective campaigns are those which last for years and achieve public recognition. There's a reason that Nike haven't changed their slogan in the years which they have been around for. It is so prevalent. So for me, the People's Plan for Nature and the response to the People's Plan for Nature was a process of helping to embed this in our work going forward, in being authentic to the call on NGOs to respond to the public voice. And actually what that has helped to achieve is stakeholder engagement internally. That means that I can see it happening as I speak. We've engaged with processes that we wouldn't have otherwise done through the People's Plan for Nature. We are in the process of developing our next big flagship campaign, and as CEO at CEO level is asking, how does this build from the People's Plan for Nature? So for me, that's where it was most valuable. The other aspect is about influencing. The People's Plan for Nature is effective if we can demonstrate a citizen-wide and civil society-wide response to the calls to action within the plan. And if we can't even get our act together to respond to it, how can we possibly expect anyone else to as well? So we developed that process of responding to the plan to demonstrate that it can be done, that you can self-reflect, you can look at the calls to actions that are being put upon you by citizens, and you can start to act upon them. It also helps with that integrity piece that we were talking about earlier. And that's the big piece that, Helen, I know you were really, really driving us forward with, making sure that we were distancing ourselves. The conversations that we had at length about at what point do you even release a response to this? How quickly do you respond? How do you respond? What does it look like? All of those things all feed into the integrity of the process. And we didn't agree with every call to action. And that's a really important one too. The pressure is not to take everything that the public had put down into the plan and take it as read that that's exactly what we would do, but to actually consider what they had said and why and how we would respond to that. And that's the process that we went down.
And Kat, so and Helen will say that, I'm sure I'll ask her the same thing, is it can't be that all of your colleagues were immediately impressed or positive about this. And I'm kind of interested, because you have different functions. You've kind of got an advocacy function, you've got comms, you do policy work. Did it speak to certain types of people within your organization, or is it really sort of individuals who kind of just got it or didn't get it? I'm kind of interested, because we know within governments, for example, the response varies so much between different policymakers and different policy officials. So you're not a monolith, you are a very complex organization. So do you have a sense of where it's landed well and where it's not landed so well?
I know the individuals who believed in it from the start, and the individuals who I still have to have conversations with now to kind of bring them on board to this idea, even after it's happened and even after the organisation has put its weight behind it. So that's it is a theory of change at the end of the day that you either believe in or you don't. And you also have to consider the philosophy of who we are as campaigning charities. There are some people who quite rightly hold the view that it is not our space to move into this kind of deliberative democracy space, and that they're more than welcome to that opinion. And there are others who already were engaged with citizens' assemblies way before I was, and really excited to see it happening. And that spectrum plays out across all three of our organisations, I would say. The trick is getting people with the influence to believe in it, and I think we've been successful to varying degrees across our organisation, and there are still people that don't think it's the right way to campaign. Genuinely think that our organisation should be focusing only on politicians. They're the ones that have the power, and that should be our primary focus, and that's the most efficient use of funds. And so it's important to have those kind of philosophical conversations. I think the thing that People's Plan for Nature stands out differently is that the question was posed to us as NGOs as to what we should be doing. And we have a rigorous and integral process that has got us to that point. And that's quite difficult to argue with. Not only that, but from a comms perspective, which is often where I have to face in, it's working really well. Like, when was the last time we released a campaign where we are still getting regional media outreach 6 months later? It doesn't happen. Today, Rebecca's going to join us in the call shortly. She's just met Deborah Meaden from the Dragon's Den with the plan. We wouldn't have been able to get a meeting in the diary like that if it was just us. So the fact that it's working is helping too, at least from a comms and reputation perspective. It's something that people are excited about, and that helps massively.
We'll come back to this thing about creating this really interesting breed of activists in a second. But Helen, you've actually left RSPB, so I don't know whether that makes you more open about what you can say or not. But what is so similar for you? How was it received? What are the challenges in terms of a large organisation? And I don't mean to be rude for either of you, quite conservative organisations in terms of the type of organisation they are. That's a conservative with a small c, by the way. So Helen, what has your experience been here?
I think it sort of landed differently in different quarters. As Kat said, there was kind of varying degrees of buy-in at the start of the process. Some people were really excited about it. Some people thought it was mad. But I think for people who were sceptical about the process, I think they especially those that came to the assembly sessions or really engaged with the outputs, they can see that just by inviting people in and giving them access to a range of information in that space to have conversation and deliberation, they will come up with very, very sensible recommendations for change, which are not wildly different to the sort of spaces that we would have been wanting to advocate in anyway. And that and also it can be really transformative in building that public mandate and that public support, and transformative for the individuals that are part of the process as well, which I know we're going to come on to. So I think, you know, I think a lot of people were, although some of the detail and the nuances might not have been exactly kind of, you know, if we'd written the plan, how it would have been written, but I think there was a lot of respect for what would come out the other end. And I think it's sort of, and I really hope that it has left the organisation with a bit of faith in people and in repeating this kind of process, maybe not quite in this shape or form again, but the power of inviting people in. And I think sort of my big reflection on leaving RSPB is I was having a number of conversations in my final few weeks of people like, this is great stuff, but how do I use it? I'm not quite sure. And I think, you know, a big learning for me is actually perhaps we could have done more work with some of internal colleagues in teams that it wasn't perhaps immediately obvious how they could use the plan. So for example, if you take RSPB, it's got quite a large team that work with businesses, not in terms of business advocacy, but in terms of business advice across a range of different sectors. I had a meeting with them and they were like, we're really excited about this, but they just weren't quite sure how to use it, didn't quite have confidence about how it might feed into their work. And so that's a big learning for me, is that and it comes back to that big issue of time, really. I mean, we got sign off for the People's Plan for Nature in late May 2022. We launched the national conversation in September. So it happened really, really quickly. And at the same time as national conversation running, we were, you know, pulling together an assembly and an independent advisory group. It all happened at such pace. And I think if I was to ever do anything like this again, would run over a much longer time period. So you had that time to build the internal confidence, to bring people in. Yeah, the Queen died in between. Liz Truss had her short tenure as our Prime Minister. A lot happened in that period of time. And so, yeah, but I think if I was to go again, I would definitely do a lot more internal advocacy before the project launch, to build that kind of understanding about what does this mean for me? What might these outputs mean for me in my work?
Yeah, but that's, you know, that is exactly the same story we have with government-sponsored processes, that it's a small team who are really delivering this, and then they suddenly realise, oh my goodness, this isn't landing in the way I'd hoped with my colleagues. And I think that kind of preparation work is just really undervalued. And as you say, very often you can't do it because you just haven't got the time or the people. So I think that's a really, yes, it's really interesting how many lessons are very similar between the two. Before we just talk about follow-up, sorry, Helen, were you going to say something?
I was just going to say as well, so I think we did do a lot of senior engagement. I mean, Kat and I spent 6 months and our colleagues at National Trust as well, kind of 6 months going around and talking to people and building out the concept, and with support from Involve and the Citizenship Project and others as well. So we went through a lot of process of internal engagement, but that was all at the senior level. And I think, again, another big learning was kind of, I think we could have perhaps done a bit more to equip some of those senior leaders to lead for the project and to then work with their teams. It was always going to be impossible for a project team to be delivering the project and doing all that of internal advocacy as well. And I think there are times where it nearly killed us both. So I think there was something about a step in the process we perhaps skipped, which was around, once senior leaders had signed off this project, their role in acting in driving that forward and leading for it internally and externally too.
Yeah, no, that makes an awful lot of sense. And as I say, I think it's that's a transferable knowledge. We've had a question which I will ask you, and I'll probably ask Rebecca as well, is a question from Chris, which I think is worth picking up now, which is, because you've started talking about the plan and what was in it and things. He asks about, did people just zoom on the charismatic bits of nature, or were they actually thinking about sort of some of the underlying systemic problems that need to be fixed? So I guess that's an interesting question for you. When you look at the plan, I mean, just for something, as someone who's read it, for me, I was really surprised how much there was in there about regulation and about kind of, and about sort of legal frameworks and stuff, which was much more structural. So it didn't end up just kind of talking about charismatic species and things. So how would you kind of classify, how would you describe what came out the other end?
The project was always about systems change. It was always about looking at the fact that UK nature is in crisis, and there are various different reasons. There's a whole system that needs to shift in order to resolve that, and there are different actors within that system that hold power. And so we very deliberately commissioned a process that would look at that systemic change. And I think actually there was very little focus on charismatic species, or indeed it kind of we had very little content in the assembly that kind of looked at individual species, and maybe one or two presentations that touched on that, and the vast majority around looking at kind of that framework that sits around nature and the changes that need to happen.
Pat, did you want to add?
Yeah, I think this is where as well the framing of the initial conversation, the national conversation, is so important. I know Irene and I and Helen, we all had conversations at length just along the how do you word these questions to give space for the very little, what would you miss about nature? I'd miss the robins in my garden, right through to I would miss the air that I breathe. And those were designed to give freedom for that. We did some analysis off the back of the national conversation as well, and it was really interesting. So to your question, Chris, around did they zoom in on the charismatic bits? What was really fascinating was to see the focus on identity. There is a lot of national identity associated with nature, and the way that people connect with nature when they think about nature is often on the very it's very personal to them. It's the gardens that they grew up in as children, if they were lucky enough to grow up with a garden. It's experience with grandparents or parents or at school that they fall back on those memories when talking about what they would love and miss about nature. When you ask, the question, imagine it's 2050 and nature in the UK is thriving, what's different from now? That gives so much space for bigger thinking. And we were seeing that come through. We saw a lot in the national conversation, and you can still read those responses on the website. We've got every single one logged on the website. It gave space for the way that our mindset needs to change. It gave space for the way that our systems need to be set up so that we don't do harm for nature. And I think having that national conversation that was so in depth and broad and gave space for joy in the little things as well as big systems change, putting that in front of the Assembly is the first thing that they saw from us. They didn't even speak to us. They saw that in pictures and illustrations, in captions, before they'd even had a conversation with anyone that was designing the Assembly. I think that set them up to be thinking in that way. So that's where the new Citizenship Projects and their kind of expertise in how do you build out that model of rapid democracy, that I think that's where we gained a lot from that.
Okay, that's really helpful. So I'm just going to one more question before we have a very short break and then bring Rebecca in, is to just ask you about where you feel it is now. And I say that in two ways. We kind of, or maybe three ways. There's it within your organisations, and you were saying, Kat, people aren't used to things they're quick move out, quick turnover in terms of campaigning and things. So it's kind of quite interesting that you're trying to keep this thing alive. In terms of the role that you think the members are playing afterwards, and I guess also thinking about your relationship between the members of the Assembly, but also, you are mass membership organisations, and whether or not you think there is some way of you've been able to engage that membership, or maybe that was an area that you could have done more work on. So quite a lot going on there. But I'm thinking, we're sort of 8 months on now. How do you, where are we? What's action is happening outside of it 8 months on? Kat, did you want to lead on that?
Yeah, I mean, Rebecca will talk to you soon, but she's actually currently at the Blue Earth Summit, having just spoken to some influential business leaders, because the Assembly members are still very much engaged with the process and the plan that they have created. Our intention has always been to create what we're calling an onward journey for participants, so facilitating them with opportunities, opening the doors that we have access to, basically. The opportunity of this summit is a really good example. For individuals to have gone to this summit, it would have been prohibitively expensive. It was like £600 a ticket, but because of who we are and the fact that we were already going to be at the summit, we can open that door for Assembly members to step into their influence a little bit more. It is still an overhanging question, though, and I don't think that that has been something that we have massively succeeded in, because it should have had more structure from the start. We started thinking about the onward journey of participants after we had built the plan, after the plan had come, and it should have been baked in. It should have been approved alongside everything else much earlier. It should have been co-created with the Assembly members as part of an output of that process. That's something that we've really learned, because now it is in a place where those that are hyper engaged, and are likely people that would have been hyper engaged anyway because they had a connection to nature before, are taking action, and they feel empowered to take action. And then there are many, many people who want to do things and want to take action but don't know where to start, and we're still working with them at that point. And the challenge for us, I guess, is how do we meet people where they are and maintain the resource for that, and how do we maintain the momentum behind it? And for us, it's still something we are committed to doing, and we're talking about, what do we do to build momentum up to the 12-month mark. We've got 23rd of March 2024 as a milestone moment, as a way in which we can celebrate everything that's happened off the back of the plan. How do we keep momentum up to that point, and think about the fact that most likely in 12 months to 18 months time, there may be a different government in place? How do we set up the plan to succeed in those spaces? And so we've been working on that. We've structured it in a way which Helen and I, again, this was something that we were trying to kind of figure out, probably again too late because we were too busy doing everything else. But participants broadly are taking action across a number of categories. The first is political action. So an example is Kate Nottage, who's a retired biology teacher. I think it's biology teacher. She has created, in the craftivism space, tiny little lavender bags, and within the lavender bags she's written like facts about bees being lost at rates, and what is going on with pesticide use in the UK. And she sent them to Trudy Harrison, who's the Minister for Environment, that is related to that. She sent them to her local MP. She's continually to find new ways in which she can advocate, and she wasn't doing that before the plan. Then you have local government, and we have another participant called Rachel, who's based in Huddersfield, and she's really connected with her library, and her library is a way for her to connect in with her local councillors, and she's been doing a lot of work at the council level to try and influence her local authority to respond to the plan. Businesses, Rebecca's currently at a business summit right now, but we've also seen people change jobs as a result of being part of this assembly process. We've seen people, Rebecca's actually on the call, but she's a great example of writing directly to the CEO of Sainsbury's to say, I do my big shop in your store every week, and I cannot tell from what I'm buying what is good for nature and what's not. Communities, we've got a man called Graham who has trained 12 people in his local environment to be citizen scientists for their waterways. And then as in individual actions, most people have reported behaviour changes, from diet change to a change in the way that they garden, to a change in the way that they make their decisions, all factored around nature. So we are here, and we are listening to all of the ways that they are doing that. And the role we want to play is to facilitate more people to do more, and to make sure it's not just people that have time or money to do these things, that it's actually everyone. The beauty of the Assembly, the reason it's so powerful, is that it's representative of the UK as a whole. And I think that's where we are at the moment. We need to do more, and we know generally where we want to go with it, but we have to plug back into the Assembly, and we're finding ways in which to do that.
These members, people through Assemblies, are just such unusual. I'm so using the word creatures there. I don't mean to call you a creature, Rebecca, and I know you're coming in and say, but they are very unusual, because they're not professional advocates, but they're not, they've been touched by a process that no other people haven't been through. It's a really, I think we really struggle to think to work with them, and we need to do much more thinking about that. And I mentioned the broader membership that you have got. Has that been a difficult, trying to think, how do we relate this to our broader memberships? As a three, I mean, there are three groups here with very different types of memberships, but I'm just wondering whether that was on your radar, or you just thought that's one step too far.
No, it was always something we thought about, and something we thought about from the beginning, and we've sort of done it in various different ways. So one thing straight when the plan launched, we encouraged members and supporters to read the plan and add their voice as a way of showing that there was kind of this broad public support for it. I think we attracted, probably don't have the latest figures, but at the time I left RSPB, we were about 45,000 people, I think, had added their voice to the People's Plan for Nature. We also did a range of communications. So, for example, through member newsletters, sort of providing access to snippets of the plan, interviews with Assembly members. And there's been a feature in the RSPB magazine that kind of both took people through what was in the plan, but also the experiences of different Assembly members and what it's meant to them and kind of their onward journey. And I believe there's a feature coming up in the next National Trust magazine, which is one of the most read magazines in the country. So yeah, there has been a lot of work done in that space, but as Kat said, I think a huge learning for us is around that onward journey and kind of what happens next with the plan. I've been reflecting on this a lot since I've kind of stepped away from the project. I've had that kind of distance from it, and I think it talks to you a bit about the sort of nature of big NGOs. We're very comfortable mobilising the public with sort of fairly small scale, simple actions. And we're also very comfortable in working in an in-depth way with volunteers, where there is less comfort and is an emerging space is that sort of space of organising. And I think this is almost a version of organising, taking people through this deliberative process. And there's a real tension between that mobilising and organising, because mobilising is quick and gets you big numbers very, very quickly. Organising is slower, much more patient work, but really transformative work. And I think the People's Plan for Nature and its kind of successes and kind of bits that we didn't quite get right really speak to that tension, actually. And it's something I'm really keen to explore in my work going forwards.
That's really interesting. That's fantastic. And I'm going to, in a second, invite Rebecca into the space, but I really think I'm really getting big on this idea a bit of Zoom and virtual hygiene, which involves everybody standing up for at least a minute and getting away from your computer and going just to go and get a drink of water. So I'm suggesting we come back at 56, which is just a couple of minutes. And when I come back, I'll be talking to Rebecca, who is one of the participants who we just heard is at a business summit today. So the question of do participants do anything is really is not a question I need to ask. So in 2 minutes time, we'll restart the learning call. If everybody just wants to just have a walk away from your screen, that will be good for your soul. Okay, so is Rebecca on the call still? I know she was here. Can we bring Rebecca into the spotlight? Is that? Hello, Rebecca.
Hi, how are you?
I'm very well. How are you doing? Have you had a good day?
Yeah, no, it's been really, really interesting. It's an amazing event, absolutely incredible. Met Deborah Meaden, which is obviously fantastic.
We've got a European network, so we ought to explain who Deborah Meaden is.
Oh, so she is, well, I mean, from TV, she's on Dragon's Den, but beyond that, I don't actually know. She's big in business and believes in saving our planet and is a massive part. She actually took part of in the Save Our Wild Owls video, I believe, and had quite a lot to do with that.
So I think for those who don't know, Dragon's Den is where different people pitch future business projects, and it's a kind of quite a sort of very popular TV program. Yeah, okay. So there's no point asking you, Rebecca, as to whether or not you're still doing things after the Assembly, because you clearly are doing. But let me get a sense of, why did you agree to participate in the first place? So think yourself back, because obviously you must have been a very different person back then, because you're not probably weren't expecting to be a business conference, a year later. So why did you agree to participate? What were your sort of hopes and fears of the process?
Yeah, so when I first received the letter, I had an interest in nature. I like nature. I like being out in it. So it seemed interesting. I didn't know what a citizen assembly was. So when I sort of on the way up down to Birmingham, I didn't really know what to expect. I was quite scared because I suffer with various mental health problems, and so what to expect from the actual event didn't go through my mind as much. It was more, can I do this? Can I be in a room with 100 people that I don't know, and get involved in those sorts of conversations? Why did I sign up? This was really silly. After that first weekend, all those fears disappeared. In fact, they dropped from that first night. It's just such an amazing space. I don't know how the facilitators and everyone involved sort of did it, but it just made, personally, they made me feel really safe and secure, in that I could say my opinions, and it didn't matter that I wasn't an expert. It was, yeah.
And were you weren't concerned that this was being run by some conservation organisations and not government? It was just for you. It just sounded like an interesting opportunity to have your voice heard.
Certainly, I think it's almost better that it wasn't run by the government. Personally, it just feels less tainted and less led. There are 3 huge charities in the UK. It's their space to sort of take up and sort of launch these things. You know, they're the ones that can connect most of the people that are involved in nature. So yeah, it wasn't a concern at all, no.
And what are your thoughts about the impact of the Assembly? I mean, obviously you're doing stuff yourself. Do you feel actually the work that you've done is being taken seriously, or has been taken seriously, or do you feel there's a lot more? There's a lot more to be done, because it's a challenge when it's run by organisations which don't always have the power to deliver on the things that you want to see done.
So I mean, I didn't expect it to be as big as it was when it first came out.
You mean in terms of the broader reaction to it?
In terms of the broader reaction, in terms of the effort put behind launching it, it was still almost quite a small thing in my mind. But then, as I sort of kind of got used to being involved in these types of things, it's not picked up as much as I would have liked. I think we've had a lot of really great reactions to the actual concept of the Citizens Assembly. Often when I've been talking about it outside of things that I've been invited to through the People's Plan, that's where people's excitement really lies, is that, oh, so you were involved in the Assembly, what was that like? But I think it is really important that it is still going, and I think it's definitely gaining more traction now than it did when it first came out. Sort of, I think, and I don't know if Kat and Helen will agree, but when it first came out, it kind of was like it came out, and then it sort of, I don't know, I felt a bit of a flop and sort of a bit of a dwell for a while, but then it started picking up, and I went to the big one outside Parliament in April, and there's been various things sort of since, so it's definitely gained more traction. But yeah,
do you think you as a member, it's actually, you've got to really, you feel you have a sort of responsibility to this plan to actually engage with it, to do the kind of work that you're doing?
Yeah, definitely. I mean, I don't know if I'd say responsibility, but I mean, I definitely want to do this. I'm very passionate about it, and I think what makes it coming from people is that I'm not intimidating. I'm not an expert. I waffle and say a lot. So I'm just a normal person. So the fact that I can say these things and be in these spaces, it's almost like oh, well, this isn't just the tree huggers. This is everyone. This is a real thing. I think it definitely gives it more. Yeah, I really, really think so. Definitely. I mean, something I've been told a lot is that my passion comes through, my emotion, and because this isn't my job, I'm not being paid for this, I can put passion and say my own words, which just gives it that extra sort of sorry, yes,
it's a technical
I think
term.
that's really important. Very technical term. I'm all about the technical terms.
So Rebecca, looking back at it, if there's something that you think could be changed about the process, something looking back, because this is a learning call, we're trying to learn about what we could do better in the future. Would it for you be that could have been done differently? Do you feel where perhaps that could have led to more impact? Do you have any thoughts about that at all?
I think, as the experience of the weekend, I think that some of the talks could have been longer. I think some of them felt a little bit rushed, especially over Zoom. I think there was a woman from Glasgow, and I was struggling to understand her accent, and it was she seemed to go like a million miles per hour to get the time in. And some of these talks were really quite intense and quite hard to hear. So I think maybe just if there could have been given more time, same amount of sort of people that spoke, but just more time to sort of think, listen, ask questions. Maybe even leave some sort of space towards the end to, if we could say, could we speak to, could we hear from, sort of, unlike that last weekend, if we could say that now we've heard from these people, it's actually really interested to see what this person says, and things like that.
I've never met a participant yet who says, I wish we had less time. So it's kind of like, it seems
no more time, no more.
What I meant, Rebecca, is no one has ever said to me it would be good if there was less time. It's always more time. And so bigger budget, we need more space, etc. That's really good.
I guess as well, it maybe would have been interesting to have the sort of connectivity that we have now between like the plan and the people involved in the plan that we have during, so we could have discussed between weekends. So maybe if the budget can't be there, it could be a sharing of information, but I don't know how far that goes into breaking rules of keeping it all.
No, it's really interesting. I mean, it's always the case, almost in every assembly, the members wish that there's more space for them to work. It's a really nice finding. Okay, listen, Rebecca, I'm going to bring you back in a second. I just want to talk to Irenie, and then on straight away. Hello, Irenie.
Hi.
Crazy cool. We're going all over. So wonderful to hear how active Rebecca is with this. It's really wonderful. So listen, you're from the new Citizenship Project, which you can explain a little bit about in a second, but you've been referred to 2 or 3 times by Kat and by Helen. I'm just kind of I'm interested, how did your work inspire what they've done, and do you recognize what they've done as something that you wanted to see done?
Yeah, absolutely. Thank you. And yeah, really nice to be with everyone. So yeah, I'm Irenie. I'm one of the co-founders and then the director of New Citizenship Project. We're a small consultancy that works with organisations of all types to encourage them to kind of think about how they can drive a more participatory society through their kind of audiences, supporters, members, customers. So how can we create more participatory structures and processes within organisations to involve more people from more places in more ways. We sometimes talk about the theory that sort of underpins our work as shifting the story of the role of the individual in society from consumer to citizen, because in a consumer relationship all you do is transact, you're served, and when you're a citizen, when you're included and involved as a citizen, then you recognize that you have an interdependence with the organization, they with you, and you're able to shape and co-create and all of those kind of things. So our organization is working in that space of kind of strategic thinking and innovation around participation and citizens, and thinking of people as citizens. And we'd been working with the RSPB for quite some time prior to this programme. My co-founder, John Alexander, also recently wrote a book called Citizens, which is all about kind of the theory that underpins our work and many of the case studies from our kind of 10 years of existence as this organisation. So as I say, yeah, we've been working with RSPB. Helen was a member of our team and then went to RSPB. And we had various conversations about deliberative democracy, and Helen and I worked together on Jersey's climate conversation, which was this island-wide process. This all came from some thinking that the New Citizenship Project was doing about the role of citizens' assemblies and where it sort of fit into our narrative of more participatory structures in society in general. And one of the things that we sort of observed is that although this is a kind of emerging practice with lots and lots of people doing brilliant work and putting good theory and structure around it and studying it academically and living it, practically, that there were still sort of some opportunities to explore, innovate, shape, do things differently. And so with Jersey's climate conversation, we kind of inspired by this model of decision making that had been developed by Bain and Company, so the big management consultancy, called the rapid model of decision making. And we just started to kind of wonder, John started to wonder, what would it look like to take this model of decision making and put it in the context of democratic conversations, and kind of that's where that theory came from. So rapid is the model. I'll just quickly whip through the stages so that everybody on the call knows what those are. New Citizenship Project at the moment is working on a publication that we're hoping to put out in a few weeks' time. So Graham, maybe we can come back and share a bit more about that once that's done. But just to give you the kind of highlights and the headlines, the idea behind it is that citizen assembly could be rooted in a larger process that involves more citizens. So instead of it being kind of done behind closed doors and using sortition as the kind of the robust kind of quality assurance that is representative, what if we do that, but also we involve other people in the conversation and bring insight, reflections, thoughts, emotions, all of those things into the citizens assembly process as well. And so that's what we did in Jersey. So these stages of the process, although it's rapid, it actually works ERDAP, so bear with me. The first phase, we're working on this. The first phase is the input phase, and that's what maps onto this project as the national conversation. So the bit where we went out as broadly as possible. At this point, we're looking for openness, not representation. It doesn't matter who responds. The invitation is for everybody and anybody to respond. And that's why the questions had to be at the level of people, connecting with nature and Helen, Kat's talked about the kind of careful crafting of those questions, but knowing that we were going out widely and that we weren't going to do some polling or some quantitative research. We wanted to do a qualitative piece at that point and really get that kind of richness that we could then translate into the creative output. So input is about gathering as much input as from people involved in the topic. So in the case of nature, it could be a national conversation because it spans the whole nation and everybody in it. But we imagine that in other processes which are tighter and where the question is more specific, that you could kind of reduce down that national conversation to just the constituent audiences that might be affected or interested. And that all of those inputs are then sense made, analysed, which is exactly what we did, and then brought into the Citizens Assembly, which is the recommend phase, which obviously everyone's been talking about, so I won't go into that in loads of detail. Then there are two phases immediately after that, which is the decide and agree phases of the process. And this is where the decision starts to happen. So depending on the commissioner, in this case, the kind of decide and agree was about inviting people to respond to the plan, say what they agreed with, say why. And as you've heard, National Trust, WWF and RSPB all did that, as did some other organisations. And then the end of the process, which is, I guess, the stage that we're at now, is the perform phase. So crucially for us, we wanted to use this decision-making tool and put citizens' assemblies in the context of this wider public conversation in order to then drive action across the system. Hence the reason for having the system actors that Helen's already kind of talked about. So to kind of root the plan in this systems change thing in the first place, to have recommendations that are aimed at those system actors, and then to try and galvanize action from those system actors in response to the recommendations.
What's interesting about that model, Irene, and it relates to the first question. One of the first questions I asked Kat and Helen is that model is sort of organisation unspecific. It could either be government, it could be, you know, something being organised by a civil society organisation. So in a sense, you know, when I asked them the question, is it a problem a civil society organisation does this? For you, actually, it's more of a how does that then fit with this way of working?
Who's the commissioner? What are they asking? And then how can we make sure that we, in whatever's happening, we're identifying the system change that needs to happen, of course, and then using this model to kind of to us it doesn't matter who the commissioner is.
That's really interesting.
There's a model in that,
there's a bit of an obsession that this is a government-led government, and I think there are all sorts of reasons to think actually that shouldn't always be our focus, particularly around deliberation. That deliberation can be sponsored in all sorts of different spaces. So I think
one of our arguments is that culture change sometimes leads political change. So if you don't take and grasp that opportunity to start these conversations out in the world, you know, governments don't always get there, and they're always slow.
Particularly with the current government we've got, aren't interested in this area particularly. So why do you have to wait for the next government to come? It seems, why can't you act? So I think that makes a lot of sense. I mean, I'm just going to invite the others back in, because we've got a few other questions. So if we could bring Helen and Kat, and if Rebecca's still around, that's great as well. Just for a last quick conversation, I've picked up sort of 2 or 3 questions. Is Kat coming back in? Not Kat, is Rebecca coming back in? If she's not, I completely understand. She's got very important business people to talk to. She doesn't want to be spending time with us. So I had a bunch of questions. One of them is about what was from Tila.
Sorry, I'm here.
You are there. Okay. Right. So jump in if there's something. Don't worry. Oh, you are there. Okay. This may be a question for either Kat or Helen, which was, although we've been talking a lot about how this ties in with the work of the sponsoring organisations, how does this project tie in with the higher, sort of, not higher as in better, but within sort of government policy, whether that's at national or local level? So, you know, how is that done? Obviously, there's going to be some comms work and some advocacy work, but how do you tie it in with government policy?
Yeah, so I mean, it starts with comms and advocacy, and the advocacy is easier if the comms are there to make people, you know, what you want to get really is FOMO. You want political parties feeling like they're missing out if they don't understand the People's Plan for Nature and they don't see the benefits of of having a public assembly and a public mandate that sits behind it. So our focus has been on raising the profile of the plan, making sure that people understand this is led by citizens. So people like Rebecca, who was on lunchtime news and then repeated on the BBC News channel on the day of launch, and many other citizens as well have been fronting the People's Plan for Nature. So it doesn't come from us very often. And then we've been using our heft as organisations to open the door to the politicians. So we had participants join us for a Save Our Wild Isles Westminster reception, which was focused on the political audience and actually getting ambition from political audiences there, and that was really effective. We had the Secretary of State for Environment, the Shadow Secretary of State for the Environment, and the leader of the Lib Dems all kind of vying for nature to be, you know, a political priority.
They want their picture.
They want their picture, and they want people to see that this is something that they're taking seriously, whether or not their policies line up behind that. We've also been doing quite hefty manifesto influencing work. So at the Lib Dem conference, the Labour Party conference, which is happening right now, and the Tory party conference, which happened only last week, the Save Our Wild Isles partnership has been there. We haven't been taking participants to those events because anyone who's been to a party conference will know they are the strangest places in the world. But also it doesn't feel appropriate to be putting assembly members into something as political as a party conference. But we have been there with their messages. We have been handing out plans for nature. We have been doing that. And we've also been logging responses. So of the 45,000 people that have backed the plan, a further 20 included within that have sent emails to their MP asking them to back the People's Plan for Nature. So they're getting constituency level pressure there too. We've also seen that the requests for responses, responding to the plan as a first step, not necessarily taking up the course of action, but acknowledging it, responding to it, and putting yourself in place, has been really effective at getting some senior high-level responses back in. So the Lib Dems in particular have taken it from a political point of view. They have put it into policy papers. They like Ed Davey, the leader of the Lib Dems, name-checked it in his speech at party conference the other week. We've also seen response from senior civil servants too. So the senior civil servant for the Environment Department in Northern Ireland wrote to the Assembly personally, thanking them for their contribution, thanking them for work which will then later feed into their policy making going forward. And we sent it to a range of other actor groups that have influence in that space too. So it's still in that midst. Getting real policy change is a long-term goal, and it takes a really long time, and we've been doing quite a lot of work to make sure that what's in the plan will land in manifestos, whether or not the plan is name-checked. And for me, it's not as important that the plan is name-checked as it is that the plan is acted upon. So we're trying to push in that direction. Another good win for us was in the UK, there is a conglomerate of nature charities, and they come together under the guise of the Wildlife and Countryside Link. The Wildlife and Countryside Link have got a manifesto campaign running at the moment, and 4 of their 5 calls to action are within the People's Plan for Nature. The only one that is not referenced in the plan is on green jobs, which actually, if we'd have had content on green jobs, I could have seen the participants really, really getting behind that too. So that's really helpful because it means that the whole sector is then behind what's in the plan. And that in itself will help to achieve that. But it's long term. It takes a really long time. What we've got is a public mandate now for action on nature urgently. And the more people that respond to it, the more actors that come forward to take up the plan, the harder it will be for big system actors to ignore it.
I think that's right. And we've mentioned this, I think either you or Helen mentioned this, and maybe Helen, you can respond to this. You know, this is a really interesting intervention in the point as we move towards an election as well, in the sense of the capacity of conservation organisations to be able to say, this isn't just us, this is a wider ask. Do you see that being a value, or do you think actually people have forgotten it by then?
I really hope it will be of value. I mean, what the People's Plan for Nature is a really powerful public mandate, co-created not just by those 100 citizens in the room, but by everybody that's contributed to this process, including that national conversation. It is a really clear public mandate for change and for action on nature. And actually, in many places, the recommendations go go further and faster than the kind of NGO calls for action. So I'm really hoping that will be heard. I think we're in a really interesting moment with kind of climate in particular, but and nature as well, kind of being drawn into the culture wars. And I think it's really important in the run up to the election that that we as the NGO community and kind of people with interest in this space more broadly kind of support the public, our members, supporters, to make it clear that they do care about these issues and they're issues that they want to have a conversation about.
I don't think, I'm just checking, is Rebecca here or not? She's had to drop out. Don't worry, that's fine. Chair, there was a very specific question which Rebecca might have been able to respond to, but one of you should be able to. It was a very specific question about, did the conflict between nature and farming come up, and how was that resolved, and in a way that actually farmers could be happy about? Or, you know, I mean, so there was a very specific question from somebody who's obviously been involved in the nature farming wars at various points. So how did they manage that very difficult topic? Can you remember?
We had NFU Cymru on the advisory panel alongside Scottish crofters and alongside like agricultural policy experts. So a lot of that was worked out in the advisory group before coming forward to the Assembly, and we were careful to balance that. And I think with Assembly members, there was definitely a sense that farmers need to be supported. That's throughout the plan. It's the idea that farmers are stewards of our land. They should be supported to help protect nature. They shouldn't be penalised for trying to make a living. But there are some system actors that have more power than others. So food businesses can have a huge sway in changing the way the agricultural system works alongside governments who are handing out the subsidies. So I think it worked out in that way. Interestingly, I don't know directly if we had any farmers on the Assembly, which would have been brilliant. We possibly could have looked to try and ensure that we had farmers on the Assembly within the citizens. We certainly had people that grew up on farms, that grew up in farming communities or were living in farming communities. And I know I spoke to an Assembly member based in East Sussex, who since retirement has been volunteering on his local farm. So there were people that connected quite deeply with the agricultural community. And one in particular was one of the oldest members of the Assembly, who is based in Northern Ireland, where agriculture is such an important part of the culture there. His focus, he felt that the Assembly didn't focus enough on small landholders who make up the majority of the people within his network. And he felt that we needed to be doing more to connect with farmers at that level, and that trying to connect in at the NFU level was too high. So there was debate there. And actually Alvin, I haven't spoken to him in a long time. I'm sure he would still hold true to that now. We do still have more work to do in that space, definitely. But it was pretty unheated, to be honest. Most people kind of just agreed that food shouldn't come at the cost of the earth. It shouldn't be too expensive. It should be healthy. It sparked the national conversation on food, which the Food Farming Countryside Commission have set up as well. That has also fed back into the People's Plan. You can see that the two things echo. When you give citizens the information about food and the way that it is grown and managed in the country, there's a recognition that we are failing on almost every point. It fails its health outcomes. It's failing on soil health. It's failing on environment. It's failing on climate. It's failing farmers who don't have an ability to make a good living out of this unless they get problematic subsidies from governments that incentivizes them to destroy unusable and productive land, essentially, because of the way that it's all set up. So I think once you get into the detail, it's not as controversial as people might think.
That's interesting. They can see a way through it, through the trade-offs, etc. That's and usually, I mean, it's just one side shouting another, isn't it? At least citizens are actually able to try and weave a path through it. So we're coming to the end, and I'd like to ask all three of you just one question. We've got, and Kathryn and Helen, you've sort of answered this a bit at various points, but having looked at this process, having done this process, if there's one thing that you could have changed, if there was one thing that you could have, looking back at it, I wish we'd done X, and if someone else was doing this, I would tell them to do X, what would that X be? So Irenie, you were looking at this much more from outside, but you were very close to the project. Looking at it, we think, I wish we'd tried to do this, or I wish we'd done that better, or we had to skip that. What would that be for you?
I think generally I'm just super proud of our involvement in this project and of the boldness of these organisations to commission it. So more than regrets about what we didn't do. I'm so proud of what we did do.
You're going to say that it's just fantastic. It happened.
But
I love that. But yes,
if I could, I think we're still in this phase now. So it's not that it hasn't happened. Hopefully, it will continue to and is ongoing. But this perform phase is really exciting for me. Like the bit where we get people to act. To get people to kind of gather around the recommendations in the plan and start to do things, whether that's little community groups or at the kind of business level, or or at the local government level or at national government level. That's the opportunity that we are faced with right now. The plan was not an academic exercise and a document to kind of sit on the shelf and for a National Trust and WWF and RSPB to be proud of. We need to make those. We need to turn those recommendations into tangible action. And what I feel like, because of the timeline of the process, we didn't get the chance to do is really interrogate like where we were going to go with it by the end. And if we have that chance, then I think the plan is so strong that that's really exciting for me. So yeah, this is really so going back to something that Kat and Helen said, is this thing about actually being clear about how you're going to land this thing. I mean, yeah, I think so. I completely understand, having run 2 or 3 of these processes myself. It's the last thing you're thinking about when you're trying to actually run an assembly. Kat, what for yourself? What thing would you like to? Would you wish you could revisit?
For me, because mainly this is front and center of my mind at the moment, it's the onward journey of participants. So Rebecca is one of our most engaged, and she and Fawad, who is also at the summit, are great examples of people that are still actively pushing the plan. But I would have loved for us to have had more input on that from the very beginning, have baked that into our planning much earlier. We always knew it was something we wanted to do, but we kind of timed out ourselves on it. And I would love for the participants themselves to have more active involvement in the shape of what they do and how they are presented and how we can continue to platform them. Because the most effective, I mean, from a comms perspective and from a promotional perspective, it is them that is the most important thing in this. It is them and their relevance and their relatability, and the fact, I mean, we had Daniel, one of our participants, speak at this Save Our Wild Isles event alongside political leaders, and he was the standout figure from that event because he was speaking as an ordinary bloke who just wants to take his kids to the beach and not worry about human poo. Why does he have to worry about that in the UK at the moment? So I would put more emphasis on the onward journey after the assembly and bake that into our advocacy and comms plans going forward. That's how I would do it.
And you're thinking there about that being sort of a co-creation process.
A co-creation process off the back of the thing, maintain the assembly for maybe one more weekend to talk about, now the plan is here, how do we do it, what does that look like, and how do we bring more people who weren't in the assembly along with us so that they feel part of something bigger than just the 103 that created it.
It's fantastic. Helen, final word for you. What if you could revisit it all? And you're going to say to me, I don't want to revisit it all, I've got too much trauma, but but what would be the bit that you'd want to fiddle with?
So I agree with everything that's been said before, and I think it's really important to note that it is not the end. Like the People's Plan for Nature, we're still in that rapid democracy process, as Irenie said, and we kind of merged some of the different parts of the rapid process together, but we're very much still in that phase of people kind of looking at the plan, interrogating it, looking at what they agree with, and then deciding how they're going to respond, and then taking that action into the perform phase. So we're still very much in that moment now, and I'd love to see more of that. And I think there's perhaps some work that we've done to celebrate what has happened, because there is, you add up everything that the assembly members have done, but then if you add up what they have done through their networks, there has been a lot of action, and I think it'd be really exciting to start to look at how that starts to map out. There's been a huge crowdfunder that was set up that has supported a raft of community groups. There's a project that just launched yesterday, the Nature Neighbourhoods Project, which is looking at kind of how do we deliver the recommendations of the People's Plan for Nature at a hyper-local level, bringing together community leaders with local authorities. So there's loads of exciting stuff happening. I think my biggest learning is that we just did it all really quickly. And I don't think we could have changed that. But if I was ever going to do this again, I would do it over a much longer period of time, to allow the time to do that planning, to have the time to have that additional weekend that Kat's talked about, to have the time to plan the onward journey. But we did it, and it's here, and it is happening, and I'm incredibly proud of it. And it's been a complete joy to be on the journey with everyone who's been part of it.
Helen, Kat, and Irene, and Sarah and Rebecca, you should be proud of what you've done, because I think it's absolutely incredible, particularly as no one had done anything like this before, as far as I'm aware. I think absolutely wonderful insights. Thank you so much for all of you being so open with what you offered us today. I think we've learned a lot, and it's incredibly inspiring. I've talked to you all before, and I've really admired what you've done. So thank you very much for participating in the talk, in the learning call. We've got a workshop on the 31st of October, which is going to be looking at the question of permanent climate assemblies. We'll be looking at what's been happening in Brussels and in Milan and in Paris. And just finally, once again, I'd like to thank Helen. I'd like to thank Kat, Rebecca, Sarah. Really sorry you had to drop out, Sarah, and Irene. That has been a really fantastic learning call and incredibly inspiring. Take care, everybody.